One of the first to answer this call is surprisingly Edmund Burke, who writes his reflections on the revolution in France in 1790. In his work, he starts to defend the traditions that permeate both the English parliamentary government and the Estates General, and condemns much of what's been going on in France. So, with this one document, the same man who had fought for conciliation with the Americas, who seemed to be on the side of liberty before, is now forever identified as the founder of modern conservatism, and many of his views are still studied today. But at the time, his book is much less popular than that of Thomas Paine, who writes a reply to Burke's reflections. He is inspired also by other philosophes of the time period, and England did have some of its own. William Godwin wrote on political justice. And instead of defending the old privileges and institutions, he attacked them. Paine says that the privileges of the aristocracy, the monarchy, and the church all need to go in the modern world, and he wanted to abolish all monarchical and aristocratic oppression. Paine's work was, his work as a man, was declared seditious in England, which meant, much like some of the work of John Wilkes, no one was actually allowed to openly publish it. Despite this, it sold over 200,000 copies in the first 3 years after it came out. So, though they had first greeted the French Revolution as this happy experiment, and they were so excited about what was going to happen in France, it became clear early into the revolution that they weren't going to get a like-minded constitutional ally in Europe out of this. Instead, they were very likely to get a radical enemy. England becomes more and more alarmed as France continues this spiral to the left. Some of the French even hoped that an English revolution would take place, and this is part of what scares Pitt. But it was repressed instead. War is declared with France February of 1793. England is now set against France and its revolutionaries. Unfortunately, they hadn't really been geared up for war. And in 1793, they only had about 45,000 men against Napoleon's Continental Army. Battling the French from without, they also had to battle their own sympathizers from within. Not everyone had this about-face that Burke had experienced. Many radical groups either favored or wanted the terror to succeed. So what does England get? Its own reign of terror called Pitt's Reign of Terror, 1793 to 1794, which was the government's pretty successful attempt to eradicate any serious radical threats of rebellion. The biggest enemy, battled by Pitt's Reign of Terror, were those who wanted peace with the French. That was a no-go. The war in Ireland also led Pitt to pressure the Irish Parliament into granting Catholics voting rights in 1793. So once again, we see British politics affecting other places. Remember, Ireland had, at least temporarily, successfully garnered its independence. 1793, Catholics are granted the right to vote, and before this, of course, they had already had the right to serve in the army. That's what sparked the Gordon riots. was disappointed. It had the opposite of the intended effect. The desire for the Irish, despite the beneficent granting of these rights, seemed to only inflame them more for Irish independence. It had the opposite effect of what Pitt was hoping for by being this good and generous Englishman, letting the Irish do stuff like vote. Before long, the French tried to take advantage of the Irish dislike of England and English rule, and a French general, Humbert, Humbert, lands at Mayo in the fall of 1798. So once again, we have a foreign power trying to get in through the back door, just as Bonnie Prince Charlie had tried to get in via Scotland. Now they're trying to get in via Ireland, the French. It was a disaster for the French. There was a violent uprising at Wicklow that convinced the Protestants, most of the Anglo-Protestants in Ireland lived in the north. We talked about this with William of Orange and how they have traditionally been, the 6 northern counties have been supporters, the so-called Ulstermen. Humbert, however, is defeated. The Anglo-Irish, and along with the help of the British, managed to push them out of Ireland. He's defeated really in only 2 weeks. So this idea of a French successful invasion of Ireland is, gone. And it's all over in 2 weeks. So that in 1800, it leaves the path open for the Irish to politically and officially unite with England, which had been united already with Scotland since 1707. So what is the big effect here? Does the revolutionary spirit have an effect on England? Well, yes, of course. And you can read that too in the London Correspondence Society and some of the other documents in that same section in Cranmer. The ideas remain, but because of the successful repression of Pitt and the political maneuvering that goes on, it doesn't go into full-fledged rebellion. What happens instead is that England divorces itself from the continental powers after the Napoleonic Wars. England sees itself less as a European nation and as a sort of exception to the rules, great creator of empire, but not necessarily just sort of one of the boys in terms of European nation states. Before 1815, Britain had been part of the continental community, including the great thinkers were just as at home in Paris as they were in London. And again, you can see the sort of back and forth movement between Paris and London and the philosophes. And Edinburgh too, let's not forget Edinburgh. After 1815, this changes. Napoleon and revolution leaves its mark all over Europe. England is seen as kind of isolated and politically backwards by comparison. It's as if Pitt's repression was too successful.